Hi. Admittingly, I'm not a very smart man, so I can't figure out how to compress things and shrink them down and send them in a message or email. So I'm stuck going on YouTube, and I'm also not smart enough know how to make something private. And I've been drinking. Uh, so anyway, this is basically a reading for one person only. But so if you're not Cupcake, you probably don't belong here. If you are Cupcake, well then. I'm going to pick up where I left off with The Princess's Bride and fulfill the promise of reading you the book that I said I'd read you. So, without any uh, further ado, I'll just go ahead and just start reading. Chapter 6, The Festivities. When Inigo regained consciousness, it was still night on the cliffs of insanity. Far below, the waters of the Florin Channel pounded. Inigo stirred, blinked, tried to rub his eyes. Couldn't. His arms were tied together around a tree. Inigo blinked again, banishing cobwebs. He had gone on his knees to the man in black, ready for death. Clearly the victor had other notions. Inigo looked around as best as he could, and there it was, the six-fingered sword, glittering in the moonlight like lost magic. Inigo stretched his right leg as far as it would go, and managed to touch the handle. Then it was simply a matter of inching the weapon close enough to be graspable by one hand. And then it was even simpler task to slashing his bindings. He was dizzy when he stood, and he rubbed his head behind his ear, where the man in black had struck him. A lump, sizable to be sure, but not a major problem. The major problem was what to do now. Vizzini had strict instructions for occasions such as this. When a plan went wrong, go back to the beginning. Back to the beginning and wait for Vizzini. Then regroup, replan, start again. Inigo had even made a little rhyme out of it for Physic, so the giant would not have problems remembering what to do in time of trouble. Full, back to the beginning is the rule. Inigo knew precisely where the beginning was. They had gotten the job in Florin City itself, the thieves' quarter. Vizzini had made an arrangement alone, as he always did. He had met with their employer, had accepted the job, had planned it, all in the thieves' quarter. So the thieves' quarter was clearly the place to go. Only Inigo hated it there. Everybody was so dangerous, big, mean, and muscular. And so what if he was the greatest fencer in the world? Who would know it to look at him? He looked like a skinny Spanish guy. That might have been fun to rob. You couldn't walk around with a sign saying, "Be careful, this is the greatest fencer since the death of the wizard of Corsica. Do not burgle." Besides, and here Inigo felt deep pain, he wasn't that great a fencer. Not anymore. He couldn't be. Hadn't he just been beaten? Once true, he had been a titan, but now. Cupcake, I am not going to go through the lies of the Morgenstern. When I return this book to you, you can read all the little fibbing subtexts that the author is a jackass in writing. As we have well discovered, none of this is true, and I'm not going to waste my breath with it. You can go back and read it. Moving on. The thieves' quarter was worse than he remembered, always before. Physic had been with him. They had made rhymes, and Physic was enough to keep any thief away. Inigo moved, panicked up the dark streets, desperately afraid. Why this giant fear? What was he afraid of? He sat on a filthy stoop and pondered. Around him there were cries in the night, and from the alehouse vulgar laughter. He was afraid. He realized then, because as he sat there, gripping the six-fingered sword for confidence, he was suddenly back to what he had been before Vinzini had found him, a failure. A man without point, with no attachment to tomorrow. Inigo had not touched brandy in years. Now he felt his fingers fumbling for money. Now he heard his footsteps running toward the nearest alehouse. Now he saw his money on the counter. Now he felt the brandy bottle in his hands. Back to the stoop he ran. He opened the bottle. He smelled the rough brandy. He took a sip. He coughed. He swallowed. He coughed again. He gulped it down and gulped it some more, and half begun a smile. His fears started to leave him. After all, why should he have been afraid? He was Inigo Montoya. The bottle was half gone now. Son of the great Domingo Montoya. So what was there in the world worth fearing? Now all the brandy was gone. How dare fear approach a wizard such as Inigo Montoya? Well, never again. Into the second bottle. Never, 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 never again. He sat alone and confident and strong. His life was straight and fine. He had money enough for brandy, and if you had that, you had the world. He stood. The stoop was wretched and bleak. Inigo slumped there, quite contented, clutching the bottle in his once trembling hands. Existence was really very simple when you did what you were told. Nothing could be simpler or better than what he held in store. All he had to do was wait and drink until Vinzini came. Physic had no idea how long he was unconscious. He only knew as he staggered to his feet on the mountain path that his throat was very sore, where the man in black had strangled him. What to do? The plans had gone wrong. Physic closed his eyes, trying to think. There was a popular place to go when plans went wrong. And there's a bottle of brandy. But he couldn't quite remember it. Inigo had made a rhyme up for him so he wouldn't forget. And now even with that, he was so stupid he had forgotten. What was it? Was it stupid, stupid, go and wait for Vinzini with Cupid? That rhymed. But where was the Cupid? Dummy, dummy, go out now and fill your tummy? That rhymed too. But what kind of instructions were those? What to do, what to do. Dunce, dunce, use your brain and do it right for once. No help. Nothing was any help. He never had done anything right, not in his whole life, until Vinzini came. And without another thought, Physic ran off into the night after the Sicilian. Vinzini was napping when he got there. He had been drinking wine and dozed off. Physic dropped to his knees and put his hands in prayer position. Vinzini, I'm sorry, he began. Vinzini napped on. Physic shook him gently. Vinzini did not wake. Not so gently this time. Nothing. Oh, I see, you're dead, Physic said. He stood up. He's dead, Vinzini is, he said softly, and then with not a bit of help from his brain, a great scream of panic burst from the throat into the night. Inigo! And he whirled back down the mountain path because if Inigo was alive, it would be all right. It wouldn't be the same, no, it could never be without Vinzini to order them and insult them as only he could, but at least there would be time for poetry. And when Physic reached the cliffs of insanity, he said, Inigo, Inigo, here am I. To the rocks, and I'm here, Inigo, it's your Physic. To the trees, and Inigo, Inigo, answer me, please. All over until there was no other conclusion to draw, but that just as there was now no Vinzini, so there was also no Inigo, and that was hard. It was, in point of fact, too hard for Physic, so he began to run, crying out, Be with you in a minute, Inigo, and right behind you, Inigo, and hey, Inigo, wait up. Wait up, straight up was the way he ran. And wouldn't there be fun with rhymes once Inigo and him were together again? But after an hour or so of shouting, his throat gave out because he had, after all, been strangled almost to death in a very recent past. On he ran on until finally he reached a tiny village and found, just outside of town, some nice rocks that formed kind of a cave, almost big enough for him to stretch out in. He sat with his back against the rock and his hands around his knees, and his throat hurting until the village boys found him. They held their breath and kept close as they dared. Physic hoped they would go away, so he froze, pretending to be off with Inigo, and Inigo would say barrel, and Physic, right quick, would come back. Carol. And maybe they would sing a little something until Inigo said serenade, and you couldn't stump Physic with one that easy because of centigrade. And then Inigo would make a word about the weather, and Physic would rhyme it, and it was how it went on until the village boys stopped being afraid of him. Physic could tell that because they were creeping very close to him now, and all of a sudden yelling their lungs out and making crazy faces. He didn't really blame them. He looked like the kind of person you'd do that to. Mocked. His clothes were torn and his throat was gone, and his eyes were wild, and he probably would have yelled too if he'd been their age. It was only when they found him funny that he found it, though. He did not know the word degrading. No more yelling, just laughter now. Laughter, Physic thought. And then he thought, grifter. Because that's all he was to them. Some huge funny thing that couldn't make much noise. Laughter, grifter, from now to hereafter. Physic huddled up in his cave and tried looking on the bright side. At least they weren't throwing things at him. Not yet, anyway. Wesley awoke chained in the giant cage. His shoulder was beginning to fester from the gnawing and digging from the ROUS. Rats of unusual size. He had done to his flesh. He ignored his discomfort momentarily to try and adjust to his surroundings. He was certainly underground, and it was not lack of windows that made that sure, more the darkness. From somewhere above him now he could hear the animal sounds, an occasional lion roar and a yelp of a cheetah. Shortly after his return to consciousness, the albino appeared, bloodless with skin as pale as a dying birch. The candle that served to illuminate the cage made the albino seem totally like a creature who had never seen the sun. The albino held a tray which carried many things, bandages and food and healing powders and brandy. Where are we? From Wesley. A shrug from the albino. Who are you? A shrug. That was almost the entire extent of the fellow's conversation. Wesley asked question after question while the albino tended and redressed his wound, then fed him food that was warm and surprisingly good and plentiful. Shrug, shrug. Who knows I'm here? Shrug. Lie, but tell me something. Give me an answer. Who knows I'm here? Whispered. I know they know. They. Shrug. The prince and the count, you mean? Nod. And that's all? Nod. When I was brought in, I was half conscious. The count was giving the orders, but 3 soldiers were carrying me. They know too. Shake whispered. Knew. They're dead, that's what you're saying. Shrug. Am I to die then? Shrug. Wesley lay back on the floor of the giant underground cage, watching as the albino silently reloaded the tray, gilded from sight. If the soldiers were dead, surely it was not unreasonable to assume that he would eventually follow. But if they wanted his erasure, surely it would also not unreasonable to assume that they had not the least intention of doing it immediately. Else why tend his wounds? Why return his strength with good warm food? No, his death would be a while yet. But in the meantime, considering the personalities of his captors, it was finally not unreasonable to assume that they would do their best to make him suffer greatly. Wesley closed his eyes. There was pain coming, and he had not been ready for it. He had prepared his brain. He had to get his mind controlled and safe from their efforts, so that they could not break him. He would not let them break him. He would hold together against anything and all, at all, and all. If only they gave him sufficient time to make ready, he knew he could defeat pain. It turned out they gave him sufficient time. It was months before the machine was ready. But they broke him anyway. At the end of the 13th day of festivities, with the 60 days more of partying to enjoy, Buttercup was genuinely concerned that she might lack the strength to endure. Smile, smile, hold hands, bow and thank over and over. She was simply exhausted from 1 month. How would she survive it twice? It turned out because the king's health had to be both easy and sad, for with 55 days to go, Lotharing began to weaken terribly. Prince Humperdinck ordered new doctors brought in. There was still the last miracle man alive, Max, since they had fired him long ago. Bringing him back on the case now was simply not deemed wise. If he was incompetent, then, when Lotharing was desperately ill, how could he suddenly be a cure-all now, with Lotharing dying? The new doctors all agreed on various tried-and-true medications. Within 48 hours of their coming on the case, the king was dead. The wedding date, of course, was unchanged. It wasn't every day a country had a 500th anniversary, but all the festivities were either curtailed entirely or vastly cut down, and Prince Humperdinck became 45 days from the wedding, King of Florin. And that changed everything, because before he had taken nothing but his hunting seriously. Now he had to learn everything, learn to run a country, and he buried himself in books and wise men, and how did you tax this, and when you should tax that, and foreign entanglements, and who could be trusted, and how far with what. And before her lovely eyes, Humperdinck changed from the man of fear and action to one of frenzied wisdom, because he had to get it straight now before any other country dared interfere with the future of Florin. So the wedding, when it actually took place, was a tiny thing and brief, sandwiched between a minister's meeting and a treasury crisis. And Buttercup spent her first afternoon as queen, wandering around the castle, not knowing what in the world to do with herself. It wasn't until King Humperdinck walked out on the balcony with her to greet that gigantic throng that had spent the day in patient waiting that she realized it had happened. She was queen. Her life, for whatever it was worth, belonged now to the people. They stood together on the castle balcony, accepting the cheers and the cries and the endless triumph, thunderous hips, until Buttercup said, "Please, may I walk once more among them?" And the king said with a nod that she might, and down she went, on the day of wedding announcement, radiant and alone, and again the people swept apart to let her pass, weeping and cheering and bowing, and then one person booed. On the balcony, watching it all, Humperdinck reacted instantly, gesturing soldiers into the area where the sound had come. Dispatching more troops quickly down to surround the queen, and like clockwork, Buttercup was safe. The boo apprehended and led away. "Hold a moment," Buttercup said, still shaken by the unexpectedness of what had happened. The soldier who held the booer stopped. "Bring her to me," Buttercup said. In a moment, the booer was right there, eye to eye. It was an ancient woman, withered and bent, and Buttercup thought of all the faces that had gone by in her lifetime. But this one she could not remember. "Have we met?" the queen asked. The old one shook her head. "Then why on this day, why do you insult the queen?" "Because you are not worthy of cheers," the old woman said, and suddenly she was yelling. "You had love in your hands, and you gave it all up for gold." She turned to the crowd. "It is true what I tell you." There was love alongside her in the fire swamp, and she dropped it from her fingers like garbage. And that is what she is, the queen of garbage. I'd given my word to the prince, Buttercup began, but the old woman would not be quieted. Ask her how she got through the fire swamp. Ask her if she did it alone. She threw her love away to be the queen of grime, the queen of muck. I am old and life means nothing to me, so I am the only person in all this crowd to dare tell the truth. And the truth says bow to the queen of flatulence, if you want to, but not I. Cheer the queen of slime and odor, if you want to, but not I. Rave over the beauty of the queen of the cesspool, but not I, not I. She was advancing on Buttercup now. Take her away, Buttercup ordered. But the soldiers could not stop her, and the old woman kept coming. Her voice was getting louder, louder, and louder, and louder, and louder, and louder, and Buttercup woke up screaming. She was in her bed, alone and safe. The wedding was still 60 days away, but her nightmares had begun. The next night she dreamed of giving birth to their first child, and more Morgenstern lies. Oh my God, no. Cupcake, I know that you're going to hate me for this, but I'm not going to read that. It's just a bunch of gobbledygook. We've been over this. This is talking about things that didn't happen, and publishers and things that didn't happen, and the Morgenstern that obviously didn't happen, and history that didn't happen. Goes on for pages. It's just the ranting of a lunatic writer. Yeah, you've read the book, so you know what he's saying, and it's just a bunch of garbage. So we're just going to move on. Anyway, the next night she dreamed of giving birth to their first child, and it was a girl, a beautiful little girl. And Buttercup said, I'm sorry it wasn't a boy. I know you need an heir. And Humperdinck said, Beloved, sweet, don't concern yourself with that. Just look at the glorious child God has given us. And then he left Buttercup, held the child to her perfect breast, and the child said, Your milk is sour. And Buttercup said, Oh, I'm sorry. And so she shifted to the other breast, and the child said, No, this is sour too. And Buttercup said, I don't know what to do. And the baby said, You always know what to do. You always know exactly what to do. You always do exactly what's right for you. And for the rest of the world can go on hang. Go hang. And Buttercup said, You mean Wesley? And the baby said, Of course I mean Wesley. And Buttercup explained patiently, I thought he was dead, you see. I'd given my word to your father. And the baby said, I'm dying now. There is no love in your milk, and your milk has killed me. That wasn't in the movie. And then the child stiffened and cracked and turned in Buttercup's hand to nothing but dry dust, and Buttercup screamed and screamed. Even when she was awake again, with 59 days to go till her marriage, she was still screaming. The third nightmare came quickly, and the following evening, and again it was a baby, this time a son, a marvelous strong boy. And Humperdinck said, Beloved, it's a boy. And Buttercup said, I didn't fail you, thank heavens. And then he was gone, but Buttercup called out, May I see my son now? And all the doctors scurried around inside her royal room, but the boy was not brought in. What seems to be the trouble? Buttercup called out, and the chief doctor said, I don't quite understand, but he doesn't want to see you. And Buttercup said, Tell him I am his mother, and I am the queen, and I command his presence. And then he was there, just as handsome a baby boy as anyone could wish for. Close it, Buttercup said. and the doctors closed the door. The baby stood in the corner as far from the bed as he could. Come here, darling, Buttercup said. Why, are you going to kill me too? I'm your mother and I love you. Now come here. I've never killed anybody. You killed Wesley. Did you see his face in the fire swamp when you walked away and left him? That's what I call killing. When you're older, you'll understand things. And now I'm going to tell you again. Come here. Murderer, the baby shouted. Murderer. But by then she was out of bed and she had him in her arms and was saying, stop that this instant. I love you. And he said, your love is poison. It kills. And he died in her arms, and she started to cry. Even when she was awake again with 58 days to go to her marriage, she was still crying. The next night, she simply refused to go to sleep. Instead, she walked and read and did needlework, and drank cup after cup of steaming tea from the Indies. She felt sick with weariness, of course, but such was her fear of what she might dream that she preferred any waking discomfort to whatever sleep might have to offer. And at the dawn, her mother was pregnant too. Her mother was pregnant. No more than pregnant, her mother was having a baby. And as Buttercup stood there in the corner of the room, she watched herself being born. And her father gasped at her beauty, and so did her mother and the midwife from the first to show concern. The midwife was a sweet woman, known throughout the village for her love of babies. And she said, look, trouble. And the father said, what trouble? Where before did you ever see such beauty? And the midwife said, don't you understand why she was given such beauty? It is because she has no heart. Here, listen. The baby is alive, but there is no beat. And she held Buttercup's chest against the father's ear, and the father could only nod and say, we must find a miracle man to place a heart inside. But the midwife said that would be wrong. I think I have heard before of creatures like this, the heartless ones. And as they grow bigger, they get more and more beautiful, and behind them is nothing but broken bodies and shattered souls. And these without hearts are anguish bringers. And my advice would be, since you're both still young, to have another child, a different child, and be rid of this one now. But of course the final decision is up to you. And the father said to the mother, well? And the mother said, since the midwife is the kindest person in the village, she must know a monster when she sees one. Let's get to it. So Buttercup's father and Buttercup's mother put their hands to the baby's throat, and the baby began. There's a little teacup, by the way. To gasp. Even when Buttercup was awake again at dawn, with 57 days to go to her marriage, she could not stop gasping. From then on, the nightmares became simply too frightening. When there were 50 days to go, Buttercup knocked one night on the door of Prince Humperdinck's chambers. She entered when he bid her to. I see trouble, he said. You look very ill. And so she did. Beautiful, of course, still that, but no way well. Buttercup did not see quite how to begin. He ushered her into a chair. He got her some water. She sipped at it. Staring dead ahead, he put the glass to one side. At your convenience, princess, he said. It comes to this, Buttercup began, and the fire swamp. I made the worst mistake in all the world. I love Wesley. I always have. Seems I always will. I do not know. This is when you came to me. Please believe what I am about to say. When you said that I must marry you or face death, I answered. Kill me, I meant that. I mean this now, too. If you say I must marry you in 50 days, I will be dead by morning. The prince was literally stunned. After a long moment, he knelt by Buttercup's chair and in the gentlest voice started to speak. I admit that when we first became engaged, there was no love involved. That there was much my choice as yours, though the notion may have come from you, but surely you must have noticed that in the last month of parties and festivities a certain warming of my attitude. I have. You have been both sweet and noble. Thank you. Having said that, I hope you appreciate how difficult the next sentence is for me to say. I would die myself rather than cause you unhappiness by standing in the way of your marrying the man you love. Buttercup wanted almost to weep with gratitude. She said, I will bless you all the days for your kindness. Then she stood. So it's settled. The wedding is off. He stood too, except for perhaps one thing. That being, have you considered the possibility that he might not now want you to, any longer to marry you? Until that moment, she had not. You were, I hate to remind you, not to go altogether gentle with his emotions in the fire swamp. Forgive me for saying that, beloved, but you did not leave him much in the lurch, in a manner of speaking. Buttercup sat down hard. She turned now to be stunned. Humperdinck knelt again beside her. This Wesley of yours, this sailor boy. He has pride. Buttercup managed to whisper, more than any man alive, I sometimes think. Well, consider then, dearest. Here he is, off sailing somewhere with the dread pirate Roberts. He has had a month to survive the emotional scars you dealt him. What if he wants to remain single? Or worse, what if he has found another? Buttercup was now even beyond whispering. I think, sweetest child, that we should strike a bargain. You and I. If Wesley wants to marry you still, bless you both. If for reasons unpleasant to mention, his pride will not let him, then you will marry me as planned, and be the Queen of Florin. He couldn't be married, I'm sure. Not my Wesley. She looked at the prince. But how can I find out? What about this? You write him a letter telling him everything. We'll make 4 copies. I'll take my 4 fastest ships and order them off in all directions. The dread pirate Roberts is not more than a month's sail from Florin. Whichever of my ships find him will run the white flag of truce, deliver your letter, and Wesley can decide. If no, he could speak to that message to my captain. If yes, my captain will sail him here to you, and I will have content myself somehow with a lesser pride. I think I'm not sure, but I definitely think that this is the most generous decision I have yet heard. Do me this favor then in return. Until we know Wesley's intentions, one way or another, let us continue as we have, so his festivities will not be halted. And if I seem too fond of you, remember that I cannot help myself. Agreed, Buttercup said, going to the door, but not before she kissed his cheek. He followed her. Off with you now and write your letter. And he returned the kiss, smiling with his eyes at her until the corridor curved from her from his sight. There was no doubt whatsoever in his mind that he was going to seem fond of her in the days ahead, because when she died of murder on their wedding night, it was crucial for all Florin to realize the depth of his love, the epical size of his loss, since no one would dare hesitate to follow him in the revenge war that he was to launch against Gilder. At first, when he hired the Sicilian, he was convinced it was best that someone else do her in, all the while making it appear the work of the soldiers of Gilder. And when the man in black had somehow materialized to spoil his plans, the prince came close enough to going insane with rage. But now his basically optimistic nature had reasserted itself. Everything always worked out for the best. The people were infatuated with Buttercup now, as they had never been before her kidnapping. And when he announced from the castle balcony that she had been murdered, he had already saw the scene in his mind. He would arrive just too late to save her from strangling, but soon enough to see a Gilderian soldier leaping from the window of his bedroom to the soft ground below, where he made that speech to the masses on the 500th anniversary of his country. Well, there wouldn't be a dry eye at the square, and although he was just the least bit perturbed, since he had never actually killed a woman before with his bare hands, There was a first time for everything. Besides, if you wanted something done right, you did it yourself. That night they began to torture Wesley. Count Rugen did the actual pain-inducing. The prince simply sat by asking questions out loud, inwardly admiring the count's skill. The count really cared about pain. That's why the whys behind the screams interested him fully as much as the anguish itself. And whereas the prince spent his life physically following the hunt, Count Rugen read and studied anything he could get his hands on, dealing with subjects of distress. All right, now, the prince said to Wesley, who was in the great fifth-level cage, before we begin, I want you to answer me this. Have you any complaints about your treatment thus far? None whatsoever, Wesley replied. And in truth, he had none. Oh, he might have preferred being unchained a bit now and then, but if he were to be a captive, he wouldn't ask for more than he had been given. The albino's medical ministrations had been precise, and his shoulder was fine again, and the food the albino brought had always been hot and nourishing. The wine and brandy wonderfully warming against the darkness in the underground cage. You feel fit, that the prince went on. I assume my legs are a little stiff from being chained, but other than that, yes. Good. Then I promise you this, as God himself is my witness, and so the next question I will set you free this night. But you must answer it honestly, fully, without withholding nothing. If you lie, I will know, and then I will loose the count on you. I have nothing to hide, Wesley said. Ask away. Who hired you to kidnap the princess? It was someone from the Guilder. There's Wesley in jail. We found fabric indicating as much on the princess's horse. Tell me the man's name, and you are free. Speak. No one hired me, Wesley said. I was working strictly freelance, and I didn't kidnap her. I saved her from the others who were doing that very thing. You seem like a reasonable fellow, and my princess claims to have known you many years, so I'll give you on her account one last and final chance. The name of the man in Guilder who hired you. Tell me or face torture. No one hired me, I swear. The count set fire to Wesley's hands. Nothing permanent or disabling. He just dipped Wesley's hands in oil and brought a candle close enough to see set things bubbling. When Wesley started to scream, no one, no one, no one on my life, a sufficient number of times, the count dipped Wesley's hands in water, and he and the prince left via underground entrance, leaving the medication to the albino, who was always nearby during the torturing times, but never visible enough to be distracting. I feel quite invigorated, the count said, as he and the prince began to ascend the underground staircase. It's a perfect question. He's telling the truth, clearly. We both know that. The prince nodded. The count was privy to all the innermost plans for a revenge war. I'm fascinated to see what happens, the count went on. Which pain will be the least endurable? The physical or the mental anguish of having freedom offered if the truth is told, then telling him that it being thought a liar. I think the physical, said the prince. I think you are wrong, said the count. Actually, they were both wrong. Wesley suffered not at all throughout. His screaming was totally a performance to please them. He had been practicing his defenses for months now, and he was more than ready. The minute the count brought the candle close, Wesley raised his eyes to the ceiling, dropped his eyelids over them. In a state of deep and steady concentration, he took his brain away. Buttercup was what he thought of, her autumn hair and perfect skin, and he brought her very close beside him, and had her whisper in the ear throughout the burning, I love you. I love you. I only left you in the fire swamp to test your love for me. It is as great as mine for you. Can two such loves exist on one planet at one time? Is there that much room, beloved Wesley? The albino bandaged his fingers. Wesley lay still. For the first time, the albino started things. Whispered, "You better tell them." From Wesley, a shrug. Whispered, "They never stop, not once they start. Tell them what they want to know and have it done with." Shrug. Whispered, "The machine is nearly ready. They are testing it on animals now." Shrug. Whispered, "It is for your own good I tell you these things." "My own good? What good? They're going to kill me anyway." From the albino. Nod. The prince found Buttercup waiting unhappily outside his chamber doors. "It's my letter," she began. "I cannot make it right." "Come in, come in," the prince said gently. "Maybe we can help you." She sat down in the same chair as before. "All right, I'll close my eyes and listen. Read to me." "Wesley, my passion, my sweet, my only, my own. Come back, come back. I shall kill myself otherwise. Yours in torment, Buttercup." She looked at Humperdinck. "Well, do you think I'm throwing myself at him?" "It does seem a bit forward," the prince admitted. "It doesn't leave him a great deal of room to maneuver. Will you help me improve it, please?" "I'll do what I can, sweet lady, but first it might help if I knew just a bit about him. If he really is so wonderful, this Wesley of yours." "Not so much wonderful as perfect," she replied. "Kind of flawless. More or less magnificent. Without blemish. Rather the ideal side." She looked at the prince. "Am I being helpful?" "I think emotions are clouding your objectivity just a bit. Do you actually think there is nothing the fellow can't do?" Buttercup thought for a while. "It is not so much that there is nothing he can't do. It's more that he can't do it all better than anybody else can do it." The prince chuckled and smiled. "In other words, for an example, you mean if he wanted to hunt, he could out-hunt again, for example, someone such as myself?" "I would think if he wanted to, he could, quite easily. But he happens not to like hunting, at least to my knowledge. Though maybe he does, I don't know. I never knew he was so interested in mountain climbing, but he scaled the cliffs of insanity under the most adverse conditions. Everyone agrees that is not the easiest thing in the world to accomplish." "Well, why don't we just begin your letter with the divine Wesley and appeal to his sense of modesty?" the prince suggested. Buttercup began to write, stopped. "Does divine begin D-E or D-I?" "D-I, believe, amazing creature," the prince replied, smiling gently as Buttercup commenced the letter. They composed it in 4 hours. "Many, many times," she said, "I could never get through this without you." And the prince was always modest, asking little helpful personal questions about Wesley as often as possible, without drawing attention to it. And this way, well before dawn, she told him, smiling as she remembered of Wesley's early fears of spitting ticks. And that night on the 5th level cage, the prince asked, as he was always to ask, "Tell me the name of the man in Gilder who hired you to kidnap the princess, and I promise you immediate freedom." And Wesley replied, as he was always to reply, "No one. No one, I was alone." And the count, who had spent the day getting the spinners ready, placed them carefully on Wesley's skin. And Wesley closed his eyes and begged and pleaded, and after an hour or so the prince and count left, the albino remaining behind with the chore of burning the spinners and pulling them free from Wesley, lest they accidentally poisoned him. On the way up the underground stairs to the ground level, the prince said, just for conversation's sake, "Much better, don't you think?" The count oddly said nothing, which is vaguely irritating to Humperdinck because, to tell the absolute truth, torture was never all that high on his scale of passions. He would just as soon have disposed of Wesley right then. If only Buttercup would admit that he, Humperdinck, was the better man. But she would not, and simply would not. All she ever talked about was Wesley. All she ever asked about was Wesley. Days went by, weeks went by, party after party went, and all Florin was moved by the spectacle of the great hunting prince, at last so clearly, wonderfully in love. But when they were alone, all she said was, "I wonder where my Wesley could be. What could be taking him so long? How can I live until he comes? Maddening. So each night the Count's discomforts, which made Wesley writhe and twist, were really sort of all right. The Prince would manage an hour or so of spectating before he and the Count would leave. The Count, still oddly silent, and down below tending the wounds, the albino would whisper, "Tell them, please, they will only add to your suffering." Wesley could barely suppress a smile. He had felt no pain, not once, none. He had closed his eyes and taken his brain away. That was the secret. If you could take your brain away from the present and send it to where you could not contemplate skin like wintry cream, well, let them enjoy themselves. His revenge would come. Wesley was living now most of all for Buttercup, but there was no denying that there was one more thing he wanted to do. He wanted to do his time. And that's where we're going to stop for now.